everybody? It's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're talking about the late 1800s, and we're going to be talking about some money in America. Because America, we got a bunch of it in the late 1800s. The problem is, most people are dirt poor. So we're going to start talking about today how both of those two things can be true at the same time. Let's get started. So today we're going to talk about this thing called the Gilded Age. Now, the actual term Gilded Age has a cool little story with it, but let me set the scene for you. In the late 1800s, the United States had a policy, a laissez-faire economic policy. Basically, it means hands-off. The government doesn't interfere with businesses. We're a capitalist society. We're one of the first countries that really embraced this, that we allowed people to be super rich. In the late 1800s, at that point in history, previous countries, when people had gotten really rich, the government felt threatened by them and they would disappear, or awful things would happen to them, or all their money would just get taken by the government. The United States just completely does the opposite and allows people to be really rich in America. So if you make a bunch of money, congratulations. All right? It's called the market revolution. It's kind of a cutting edge concept at the time. But because of that, the United States government is just like, so business is like business stuff. Our job is like tax people and like keep an army in case we get invaded. Other than that, you do whatever you want. So there's no regulation or anything of business in the late 1800s, thus called laissez-faire economic policies. This seems fine and normal, but we start running into some issues in the late 1800s. So there's this guy, and he's important here because the term Gilded Age was created by this guy. You probably don't recognize who that guy is. He's super famous. You might. That is a man named Mark Twain. Now, if that's ringing a bell in your brain anywhere, it might not be, and I'll tell you who he is. But if you're like, Mark Twain, isn't he an author? He is. And he wrote a whole bunch of books about like being a kid and like adventures that kids would go on. You can see here in the bottom corner that I'm blocking. That he wrote books about Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. In the late 1800s, he would write these books about a middle school reading level. So America had already committed to public school so everybody could read. There's no radio or TV or anything like that. So for fun, people read these fictional books. Everybody loved Mark Twain's books, so he sold all these books. Mark Twain got rich. Now, when I say rich, he is not like the richest man in the country, but he was well off enough that he didn't have to write any more books if he didn't want to. He could do whatever he wanted, and money just wasn't an issue for him. He was that level rich. All right. So Mark Twain, we're going to talk about these guys today. They're called robber barons. These captains of industry, depending on your opinion, and we'll talk about them today, that come out and get wildly crazy rich. Mark Twain talks trash about those guys. All right? And you might be thinking, wait, Mark Twain's rich. Why is he talking trash about the other rich guys? Because those guys create things called monopolies that we're going to talk about, which prevents other people from getting rich. Nobody else could really talk trash about Rockefeller, Carnegie, these guys we're going to talk about today, because most of the country in some way or other worked for those guys. So Mark Twain was one of the few people that would come out and clearly talk trash about the way they were treating their workers and the way they were affecting society in a negative aspect. Because anybody else that tried to come out and talk trash about them would probably get fired because they some way worked for those guys. So Mark Twain called this time period the Gilded Age, and it has stuck throughout history. It's literally called the Gilded Age, first thing we're talking about today. Because America has become one of the richest countries on earth. And we're going to talk about where all this money comes from. People like Rockefeller and Carnegie become crazy rich. The problem is the vast majority of people in the United States are very, very poor because they're working for Rockefeller and Carnegie, who pay them like a nickel a day, like just enough money to survive. So from the outside of America looking in, America looks like this very rich, powerful country. But if you come into the United States, you realize a lot of it's just trash that people are struggling to survive. And Mark Twain says America is gilded, and it's called the Gilded Age. The reason he calls it the Gilded Age, what gilded means is if you take something that's not very expensive, like just regular metal, and that's what the term gilded is, take something like metal, and then you just coat it in a very thin layer of gold, it will look like the whole thing is gold. This is like a gilded mirror, and you can see where some of it has been worn off, obviously. That when this was new, it looked like a solid gold mirror frame. But just below the surface, it's just metal. He said this is what America is like. And he calls it the Gilded Age. From the outside, the rest of the world sees the total amount of money that exists in America, and it's wildly awesome. However, if you come over to America, you'll realize very quickly most of that money is held in the hands of very few people, and the vast majority of the population is dirt poor, and this whole laissez-faire, hands-off approach might not be the best way of helping the vast majority of Americans. So the question here is, explain how the United States could have become one of the wealthiest countries in the world at the time, yet the vast majority of the population lives in poverty. Use the concept of the Gilded Age to justify how both of those facts can coexist. Like, how is America, which is a true statement, one of the richest countries on earth, but then simultaneously the vast majority of people are super, super poor? So explain how both of those things are true at the same time. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, let's talk about some of the industry leaders, the guys that get wildly crazy rich. We're going to start talking about a guy named Andrew Carnegie. All right, so this is a picture of Andrew Carnegie. He's super rich. Let me tell you how. And it starts here with this drawing. There's something that comes out called the Bessemer process. So steel is better than iron in literally every possible way. It's lighter, stronger, more durable, lasts longer, less likely to rust. In every possible way, steel is better than iron. So, and people have known how to make steel for thousands of years. The problem is, it's really hard to do because you have to take iron and get all like the crap out of it, like melt it, get all the crap out of it, and then do some other sciencey stuff to it, and it turns it into steel. People had known how to do this for thousands of years, except it was really, really, really hard because once you like make it like the iron like boiling lava, like what you gonna reach in there and get all the like stuff floating around inside it out with, like a spoon, it's like it's just gonna melt. Like, you know, I just imagine like, all right, so we can make steel, we just gotta get that stuff out. And nobody knew how to do it. So while it was a very complicated process, there were steel swords and stuff like that. But it was a very intricate, very difficult process. So nobody did it, but everybody knew steel was better. Then this guy, Henry Bessemer, comes out. And what Henry Bessemer does is he comes up with a really easy way of changing iron into steel. And that's basically what this picture is. Basically, you liquefy the iron like they knew how to do, and then you basically pour it from one vat into another, and as it falls through the air, you pressurize air that shoots through it, and it blows all the imperfections out, and the only thing that's left is steel. So now, the hardest part about making steel, getting the imperfections out, is now the easiest part. Everybody wants to build with steel. There is a steel industry that skyrockets in the United States. All right, all over the world, everybody wants steel. Well, that's where Andrew Carnegie comes in. He starts selling steel and starts making money. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's how he got rich. Well, there were a lot of other people selling steel as well. All right, and he had competition. He wants to get rid of his competition. So what he needs people to do is buy stuff from him and not buy from any of his competitors. So what happens is every time, let me walk you through the process of getting steel, all right? So there's literally a mountain somewhere that some dude owns that's filled with iron ore, the stuff you use to make iron, all right? And this guy hires people to go in and get the iron ore out. Then he sells it to a factory that takes the iron ore and turns it into iron. Then that iron factory will then turn around and sell all that iron to a factory that will turn it into steel. Then, after they turn all that iron into steel using the Bessemer process, they then sell the finished iron to people like Carnegie, who then cut it up and sell it to the consumer. Every time it changes hands, the price goes up because the guy that owns the mountain, the iron factory, they all want to make a profit. So the price increases through each step. Carnegie, because here's what Carnegie and Rockefeller will talk about, both have in common that most people didn't. They already had money. All right. So not just anybody could do this. They were already rich. They become insanely like make-believe level rich, but they take all their money, or Carnegie does, and he buys a mountain for iron that has iron ore in it. He buys the iron factories. Now he's selling steel, but he buys the iron factories too. So now he owns every process of buying steel. So when it goes from the mountain to the iron factory all the way up to him, the price doesn't increase because he owns all parts of it. So at the end of the day, guess who has the cheapest steel around? Carnegie. Guess who everybody buys their steel from? Carnegie, because he has the cheapest steel. Guess what happens to all his competition? Well, they're not selling any steel because they can't compete with Carnegie. They all go out of business. Carnegie then buys all their businesses that went out of business. He buys all their stores. He buys every iron ore mountain. He buys every iron factory. Anything in America associated with the steel creation business, he buys it. Then he jacks up the price of steel because there's no competition. He owns every aspect of the entire steelmaking process and then jacks up the price, effectively making a monopoly, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. So Carnegie makes all his money in the steel industry. The other big guy here is John D Rockefeller. He basically does the same thing in the oil industry. He just starts selling his oil, because everybody needs oil for lighting and heat. He starts selling his oil for less than what it cost him to get it. Because again, he started out having a bunch of money. So he literally lost money for years selling his oil cheaper than he bought it for. So everybody in the country that wants oil buys it from Rockefeller. Well, they stop buying it from the other people. The other companies have to close because nobody's buying from them and they run out of money. Once they close, Rockefeller buys all his competition, and Rockefeller now owns all the oil industry. So Rockefeller has created a monopoly in the oil industry, and Carnegie has created a monopoly in the steel industry. So it's hard to really explain how rich these guys are. So this is one of Rockefeller's oil industries. Carnegie was worth like $350 million in his life. Rockefeller is worth $500 million. This is in the 1800s. You literally could not spend that money. Like, there was nothing you could possibly spend that money on at the time. It is incomprehensible. There's no comparison to present day, because if you want to go buy a fleet of cruise ships, you could probably find a way to spend, the richest people on earth could find a way to spend their money if they wanted to. At the time, there's literally not enough stuff to spend your money on. You could have 10 servants that follow you around all day, every day, and that would cost you, a few $1,000s a year. It's unimaginable how rich these people were. But the people that worked here for Rockefeller in these oil fields are making like a nickel a day. They're barely making enough money to live and survive. And Rockefeller could easily pay them more, but he chooses not to. The reason Rockefeller chooses not to pay these people more, in his mind, because he's a good businessman, same thing with Carnegie, they're willing to work for a nickel. Why would I pay them more? That would be dumb. Yeah, sure, I could pay them $1 a day, but why would I do that? Pay them a nickel, they'll work for it. It would be bad business to pay them more than what they're willing to work for. People need to work because they're trying not to starve to death. So Carnegie and Rockefeller are so widespread, like the majority of the country in some way works for these guys, and they're getting paid next to nothing, even though Rockefeller and Carnegie have more money than they could ever ever deal with or handle or spend. So the question here is, explain how Carnegie and Rockefeller became wealthy and what they had that many people didn't that allowed them to do so, meaning become wealthy. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so just like Rockefeller and Carnegie, they had a bunch of money to start with that got them started. Here's a couple other guys that made crazy amounts of money at the time. J.P. Morgan is really interesting. So this guy, when you have gazillions of dollars like Rockefeller and Carnegie, you need a banker. And so J.P. Morgan is basically the banker for Rockefeller and Carnegie. So he takes their money and he does these investments and stuff to help them make more money. But as their banker, he gets a percentage of the increase. J.P. Morgan really revolutionized the banking industry. J.P. Morgan got so rich just by handling the money of Rockefeller and Carnegie. At Carnegie, when he got older and wanted to get out of the steel game, J.P. Morgan bought Carnegie Steel, U.S. Steel, from Carnegie. So Carnegie's banker was so rich just managing Carnegie's money. At the end of Carnegie's life, when he wanted to, cash out, he literally sold it to the guy that was managing his money. Like, that's how J.P. Morgan made gazillions of dollars and really revolutionized the banking industry. The other guy that's considered here in the robber baron type thing is a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt. He made his money in the railroads. Now, if you look at the percentage of railroads that Cornelius Vanderbilt owns, it wasn't like he didn't own the majority of the railroad tracks. But the reason he made so much more money than other people is he didn't buy entire railroad tracks. He would just buy the bridges. If he owned the bridges, you had to basically pay him a toll to use the train tracks. Otherwise, he would just close the bridges. He was like, I'm not allowed to buy all the tracks. If I just own the bridges, people have to pay me to use the bridges, because train tracks, you can just make other train tracks pretty easily. But bridges are difficult. So Cornelius Vanderbilt made all his money in the railroad industry. To show you how rich these guys are, and there's a visual representation. This is the Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. It's the largest single-family home in America. All right, it was built by it's insane. It was built by Vanderbilt's grandson, the largest house in America. This wasn't built by the robber barons, one of the guys. This was built with grandson money. All right, it's just which also Pisgah National Forest, if you're familiar, that was the land that they owned. They bought Pisgah National Forest. They actually bought a whole mountain range, and then ended up in the 1900s giving it to North Carolina, which has become Pisgah National Forest. So not only is this the largest house ever, they literally bought a forest, is their plot of land, which is now Pisgah National Forest. So these guys, Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, they have monopolies. So there's an issue here. Is this bad? These guys got super rich. So what? And that's kind of the mentality at the time. Cool. America's cool with people being rich. These guys haven't broken any laws, right? So good on them. They just won at being American. And so that's why these guys are allowed to get super rich. Everything's good. High fives. But then they realize, once these guys are rich, they actively prevent other people from creating steel industries or coming into the oil industry or getting into banking or getting into railroads. These guys effectively stop other people from being successful aggressively, not just because they exist, but they actively spend their time preventing other Americans from having any type of success like they did. That is when it starts becoming an issue and people start trying to figure out, okay, are what these guys doing wrong because they are preventing anybody else from becoming successful because they are actively holding down industries? Or are they just winning at being American? And so today we know monopolies are wrong, because if one company owns the entire industry, it's really bad for consumers and it really hurts the economy as a whole. we know that today. Then they're struggling with that. Is it bad to have these monopolies, or are they just winning at being American? So that's what the question here is. Today we know that monopolies are bad for the free market society like we have today. However, this understanding wasn't so clear-cut in the 1800s. Explain the controversy and confusion that surrounds the idea of monopolies when they first came out. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So I use the term robber baron here pretty extensively. They would call themselves a captain of industry. They are a positive. They are good. They're leading cutting edge. Look at all the people that we employ. Well, all the people they employ, which is millions of people in the United States, are like, you literally are paying me $0.05 a day. You could pay me $1 a day, and you would still be the richest man on earth, kind of thing. Please don't starve me to death. But robber barons, it's a negative term given to them, all right, because they're barons, leaders of industry. They're like, but why would I give you more money if you're willing to work for a nickel? All right. So, robber baron is a negative name given to these guys by a lot of their workers. But nobody would dare come out and talk trash about them because you would immediately be fired and nobody else will hire you since they basically own business. This is why Mark Twain is such a vocal point in American history, because he can go talk trash about these guys because he sells books. He's not in any way connected with these guys. They can't hurt him financially or fire him or anything like that. Now, when you are one of these rich guys that have more money than you could possibly imagine, you look outside as people are starving to death in the streets, how does it not affect your conscience? Well, there's two concepts that these guys kind of play up here on kind of justifying why this is okay for them to be rich and everybody else is poor. The first one is this concept of social Darwinism. The idea that the reason I, as a leader of this industry, am crazy wealthy and they are poor is because I'm just better than them, naturally. I'm rich because I'm strong. They're poor because they're weak. If you gave them $1 million and made me $0 in air and made me broke, I would find a way to be rich again. That person would find a way to be poor again. That is why I don't feel bad about this, because this is just my natural location in society is to be a rich person. So they try to rationalize that the reason they are rich and the other people aren't is because they are better than them. And the fact that there's no point even trying to help out poor people, because if you do, they'll just waste the money and it'll be bad for them. So they literally justify with social Darwinism that is they are stronger and therefore they have the money. Weak people don't have money. The next one is this concept of the gospel of wealth. So this actually happened, written by Andrew Carnegie. It's a book written later on in life, and it's basically a book for the other handful of people here to read. And it basically says, hey, hello, other super rich people that are reading this book. Since we are better than everybody else, since we all know that, we're rich, social Darwinism, we all bought into this, it is our responsibility to better society. So we, being super rich, have to be better than everybody else, meaning we have to improve society. Now, we're not going to give our money to the poor, because that's a big thing that all these guys believe in. Giving money to poor people, they're just going to go do dumb stuff with it. Don't give money to poor people. However, we should spend our money to improve society. So at the very end of their lives, it's kind of, they really have two entire different perspectives on when you judge these guys. Rockefeller, Carnegie, early in their life, it's really all negative. At the very end of their life, after they cash out and they have all this money, they get in a competition with each other because they know each other and they compete against each other in weird stuff because they're the two super rich guys to see who can give away their money the fastest. All right. But Rockefeller and Carnegie, under this concept of the gospel of wealth, they want to build libraries, build parks, build things for society and put their name on it. So like Carnegie Hall, big performing arts theater, Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. These places are created by Rockefeller and Carnegie with their like unlimited money in order to improve society. I say quotes because they literally slapped the name on it. It helps their ego as well. But the idea of the gospel of wealth is that you don't have a right to be a rich person, just hang out and be lazy and slothful and drunk all the time. You're required to help out society. So with the gospel of wealth, where you're required to help out society, and social Darwinism, where it's like, I'm just rich because I'm naturally better than everybody else, are the ways that these rich people can justify in America how they basically control like 99% of the wealth, and everybody else in America is like slowly starving to death. So the question here is, explain how the gospel of wealth and the concept of social Darwinism help the robber barons justify the fact they have more than they will ever want, while many, meaning most people in America, have less than they need to survive. So explain how they use those concepts to justify their place in society and be able to sleep at night. So pause me, answer that completely, or we're moving on. So, all right, so there's one guy here at the end that is worth discussing uniquely because this dude truly is a captain of industry. There's a guy named Henry Ford. So Henry Ford creates Ford Motor Company. He creates the Model T Ford. Now, he does not invent the automobile. The automobile, Mercedes-Benz, Bentley, there were a couple other custom car manufacturing companies around the world at the time using the combustion engine. Henry Ford does not invent the car. When he invents the Model T, what he made is a very cheap, reliable car that cost about $300, which was still really expensive, but it was like a fraction of the cost of any other vehicle around the earth. He also introduced the assembly line, all right, which helps mass produce it faster. Henry Ford, the difference in Henry Ford and these other guys is he says, hey, I need all these workers. And he started out doing the nickel a day thing. But working on an assembly line is crazy brutal work. It is very, very tough. It is hard. It is grueling. You have to be focused the entire time. It's awful. And people would just quit. He'd get new immigrants in. By the time they learned how to actually do their job effectively, they would quit. You had to have effective people that were trained with experience here working in these assembly lines, because cars have a lot of moving parts. Unlike the oil fields or steel, which is a very simple product at the end, cars have a lot of very specific moving parts. And Henry Ford realized that if you abuse your workers, they don't want to do it. It's a lot easier to go do literally anything else than try to work on a car. So what Henry Ford does is he says, all right, guys, I'm hiring new people. And they're like, oh, whatever. He's like, and I'm not going to pay you a nickel a day. And everybody kind of looks. I'm like, uh-huh. He says, I'm going to pay you $5 a day. $5 a day, all right, at the turn of the century is like $70,000 a year now. This is straight up middle class, almost upper middle class by that time. People flocked to work for Henry Ford because he's going to pay them $5 a day. Not only that, if you work for like 30 years and don't miss a day, you get to retire and he'll pay you $5 a day for the rest of your life. When he went to the $5 a day, you think he had a lot of people quit anymore? They didn't. Now, it is brutal. It is tough. It is very hard work. It's an 8-hour work day. Tried to give him weekends off. He needed quality, intense work. If you pay your employees well enough, you get better work. He was super rich as well. All right, and this is a picture of Henry Ford. But by paying him $5 a day, he got better work out of his workers. Sure, it was brutal work, and it was extremely tough. But he got $5 a day. Who's going to complain about that? Because that was a life-changing amount of money. He also was very clear, I want to make sure that everybody that builds my product, the cars, can buy it. He wanted to make sure everybody in his factory made enough money that if they chose to buy one of his vehicles, that they could. So he understood to get better work, you have to pay him more. And it's considered more of a captain of industry in history because of that, because he did take the workers into account here. So the question here is, why did Henry Ford pay his workers $5 a day? What was different about his industry than the steel or oil industry that encouraged him to make that drastic change from the rest of the industry leaders? Like, why did he have to pay his workers more? What was different about making a car than oil or steel? Or refining oil, I should say. All right, so answer that completely. That's what I got for you guys today. See you guys tomorrow.